And we are live. Hello, everyone. Sorry for the delay, but once again, welcome to Tech with Peter and Banugo. And on this episode of Web Performance, CDN, and Caching, I'm joined by Ben Dechrai. Hopefully, I said that well.
That was great.
Uh, yeah, cool. Ben is a security and privacy technologist, also an MVP, Microsoft MVP, which is a very honorary, should I say, award to get in recognition of how much you've made, contributed to the community. I think I knew a lot of .NET MVC back in my .NET days, but these days I more on the JavaScript side and see more of the GDGs. But happy to have one MVP today. Ben, I would hand it over to you to do justice to your introduction because I may not have a
Sure.
lot to say.
No, that's good. I think you pretty much covered most of the things there, Peter. Thanks for that. Also, I would like to take partial responsibility for the delayed start of the stream. I decided that it might be a good idea to try and see whether I could switch from Wi-Fi over to Ethernet at the last minute, and that was a very bad idea. So, so I'll take some of that blame.
Yeah.
But yes, hello everybody. My name's Ben. I've been a software engineer now for about 25 years. Started out back in 1999 with VB ASP. Very quickly got better and went on to PHP. Some people might argue that wasn't better, but it was at the time. And I've been doing like security consulting and business analysis and solutions architecture and those kind of things. And then eventually I got into developer relations. So I worked for Auth0 for a while, working on their product in developer relations. So going out and talking about it at conferences, but also meeting people in the community and finding out how they're solving identity and security issues. And yeah, I've been in that field ever since. So it's like 6-7 years now that I've been doing community engagement type work. And it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun to meet people, talk to them about how they're solving problems, learn from them. They can learn from me. It's just a really good feeling.
Oh,
And I love doing
nice.
things like this as well, live streams. It's right. It's the digital version of going to a meetup.
Yeah, and I'm glad to have you. So with the Devra one, did you why the switch from Devra? Was there something in particular? I was just a natural
So
transition.
it's a bit of a weird story. I already used to speak at conferences and stuff. Back in 2003, I started a conference in Australia that ran for about 10, 12 years. I've always loved being involved in communities and conferences and either speaking or just creating the events so the communities can come together. And because of that, I also spoke at conferences, and I loved going to start with. It was just mostly within Australia, and then I started speaking internationally. Um, and there are some conferences that will pay for speakers, pay for their travel and accommodation, and there are some that don't, depending on how much money they have, basically. And because I wasn't doing it for a job, I had to make sure I could really only go to the ones that would pay me, because
Yeah.
when you go to a conference and it's not your job to go to conferences, when you're there, you're not getting paid by your employer either. So,
Mm.
especially when I was contracting and around my own business. So, I kind of had this soft limitation of I could really only do 3 or 4 conferences a year, because any more than that, I would actually not be making enough in the year to pay my bills. So, as I was doing that, I was at a conference I think it was in Germany, actually, in Berlin. It was a PHP conference, and I bumped into a guy called Joel Law, who was a developer advocate at Auth0. Um, and developer advocacy back then, like, it really only became known about in like 2015, 2016. So this is only 2 years later after that. Or in fact, no, it was probably around that time, because 2018 is when I joined Auth0. It was about a year and a half before that. He kept asking me, he kept saying, look, if you love traveling, if you love speaking at conferences, if you love security, if you love engaging with the community, we're hiring a developer advocate. You should join us. And I was thinking, yeah, but I really like the contracting, running my own business. I'm actually enjoying it. I love going into different businesses and looking at the. I used to do security audits as well. It's amazing how scary and satisfying at the same time it is to find a database full of unencrypted credit card numbers. Boy, that gets the adrenaline going.
Or plain passwords.
Oh yeah, crikey, it's too much of that. But he kept hassling me. So I said, look, just to shut you up, I'm going to do the interview process because I want you to stop hassling me. So I did the interview process. And I thought, actually, I really like this company. I really like the idea of being a developer advocate. And ultimately came down to a decision: do I want to carry on doing more of the hands-on engineering, or do I want to do more of the community work? Because both of them had value to me. And I decided to give developer advocacy a try. So they made an offer, I accepted it, and that's how I got into it. So basically, you could say that I was bullied into becoming a developer advocate.
What a nice transition.
Right.
Yeah. I also enjoy the technical aspects, and sometimes I've thought about maybe I should apply for DevRel roles, but I feel like with what I see with some, it feels, some maybe it's all about conferences, and some is more about the community part. And I never really saw. I mean, the part of speaking and sharing knowledge I liked, but I couldn't get myself to find one DevRel job that I would say, okay, this might give me one. But yeah, I've applied a bit to. I applied to Cloudflare. I
Mhm.
didn't get that, but maybe I will find one again that I
Yeah.
find
Well,
interesting.
yeah. If you find them, just keep trying, right? You'll never get it if you don't try. But that's one of the interesting things with developer relations is the age-old question of what is it? What is developer relations? And it's different to every developer advocate has their own preference on how they do developer advocacy and developer relations, but also every company has different needs.
Yeah,
So, when I moved to the US a couple of years ago, so at that time, because Auth0 wasn't able to help me with that transition, I was looking for a new job, and the number of different ways that people wanted developer advocacy done, um, it's not quite astounding, but it's diverse. So some
yeah,
companies just want people to work on content like blogs and videos, and there's hardly any travel. Some companies want people who can just travel and go to the
yeah,
events because they want more of an outreach. So it all depends on what the business goal is of the company at the time. But then even then, when you join a company, the actual um,
job.
the targets of what you're trying to hit, the outcomes you're trying to create through that job, those will always change, which means that your job also changes. So it's always a moving goalpost. Software engineering,
Yeah,
I feel, even though we can pivot a lot in software engineering as engineers, I feel there's a little bit more steadiness there because generally you're working on a feature, like the processes are the same. The underlying framework of how you develop software doesn't change. It's just what you're
yeah,
working on might change. Whereas with developer advocacy, because it is somewhat aligned to marketing as well as product, marketing goes where the market is. Product goes where the product is. The product doesn't change that much except it grows. The market is dependent on human psychology of people that you have no control over. So that's why it can be um,
yeah.
quite
I
wavy, quite choppy seas.
True. I noticed that as well. But I feel it's quite a bit flaky in that market these days because it looks like they get easily asked by big companies trying to do layoffs and are like, okay, they are the first people to let go, or maybe some managers as well.
Yeah, I think that, and that comes down to. And tell me if you want to talk about something else other than developer advocacy. I can talk about anything all day long. I think one of the reasons, and this isn't necessarily the case all the time, one of the reasons why DevRel is early to be let off is because for a long time, especially during the pandemic, like interest rates were zero, companies were spending money, it didn't cost them anything. So the return on investment aspect wasn't as important, whereas now it's becoming more important, and people are saying, how does developer advocacy and developer relations align to business objectives? And if it
Yeah,
doesn't align to business objectives, or we can't measure how you align to business objectives, then it's the most sensible one from a fiscal perspective to get rid of. Because if you're not making money, you're not helping. The problem with
yeah,
developer advocacy is a lot of the work that we do has at least a 12 to 18-month lead time. What I do today won't actually convert into a sale for at least 18 months. And even then, say for example, I meet you at a conference and you hear about a product that I'm representing. In 18 months, you might use it. But the likelihood
true.
is that we still can't measure the fact that it was because, or in part because you spoke to me, because it might
Yeah,
not be you that buys it, it might be the company you work for that buys it. So
true.
connecting those dots is really hard. So it makes it really hard to validate developer
Yeah.
relations as value.
Yeah, I think maybe if they also look at it in terms of like long-term brand, kind. I think like Seth Godin talks a lot about this, kind of brand and makes reference to Nike, for example, and
Yes.
you can't really tell if it's the adverts Nike had in 1989 that made you buy Nike now, but they do those things, but the
Totally.
goal is not to measure it as like a key performance indicator, but to do it somewhat with the goal that in the long term it would have built up enough emotion and memory for people to
Sure.
easily buy. So, but unfortunately, when in tech companies, sometimes we still want to have metrics and all, and everything has to go in a
Yeah,
certain way.
indeed.
Yeah, but anyway, so let's not take up so much of the conversation with Deborah, and hopefully give our listeners some interesting topics. I
Right.
I asked you to come online because I would love to talk to you about security, but from the part of CDNs and maybe managing application, because I had this idea I was exploring 2 months ago, which was more like, oh, how can you like configure your own self-proposed CDN? I mean, not at the scale of Cloudflare, but more like
Sure.
run some servers across the globe and run maybe something like Nginx or the likes of Apache Traffic Server. And then I
Yeah.
started thinking also from the security aspect, when you use like Cloudflare or Fastly, you get talked about like, oh, it gives you some security benefits. And I want some of them, the standards are like DDoS,
Hmm.
and also they mention web application firewall. So I would just start with DDoS and like, or rather, from your perspective, how would you see like what areas of security do you see CDNs helping developers or applications today?
I think the really good thing about CDNs, not necessarily just from a security perspective, but the World Wide Web was designed to be worldwide.
Mhm.
But early on, it was still mostly about, the companies in my immediate vicinity have web presences, therefore I can find out about them. And if I'm going to travel somewhere, then I can find out about what's going on over there. But the world was still quite small. The internet has made the world, the world was still quite big. The internet has made the world quite small in terms of the fact now we hear news about what's going on the other side of the world immediately.
Yeah.
That still wasn't happening in the early days. So when the internet was first designed, I guess, that whole instantly available everywhere thing wasn't as important. And I think as the big companies that needed that better response times from wherever in the world somebody was, and I'm thinking of like the IBMs and the Microsofts and the big companies that had customers worldwide. Maybe not in the late 90s, but definitely now and in the past 10, 15 years. They would have to solve that problem themselves. So CDNs have solved the problem of bringing a single point of information to the world effectively. I think it's probably one of the good examples of separations of concern, because being globally available isn't the concern of the web server, or it's not the concern of the team that are trying to create online applications that their customers can use. In the same way as we tell developers, don't write your own cryptography or don't write your own authorization, it's also makes sense to say to people who are managing the operations of a web application, they shouldn't have to worry about the globalization of that application. That's almost a different layer. So CDNs have kind of filled that gap really well. And as with everything, like the nature abhors a vacuum, or whatever the expression is, if you create something, it will fill that space to the maximum extent it can. So, and that's not just necessarily a capitalistic, we need to find more ways of making money thing. It's just
Yeah.
like, well, we exist in this space now. What else can we do to help people? And once you operate at the network layer, which the CDNs do, you're in a really good position, especially that like the proxy network layer, the between the user and the actual resource that those users are trying to access. There are so many things you can layer in there. So obviously there's the performance, bring the information as close to the user as possible. There's the caching side of things. But then, as you say, there are security, not implications, but possibilities that you can consider. So as data passes through, it's harder nowadays with ubiquitous HTTPS everywhere. But if it terminates HTTPS at Cloudflare, let's say, for example, and they're able to analyze the data that goes through before it heads over to your system, which generally they can, but there are some CDNs that will ensure HTTPS everywhere so that they can't read the data either. And a lot of companies need that for their own security, data sovereignty, all of those kind of things. But where it's possible to inspect the data that's passing through, they can do things like verify that that there's no malicious intent coming through. You can inspect the payloads to detect whether or not there's a DDoS attack or a cross-site scripting attack, or all these kind of things can happen at generic levels. And then, of course, you've got DDoS as well. Like, does it look like there's a concerted DOS attack from multiple places? Is often hard to detect, especially if you are controlling just your application in one data center. Whereas when you've got a distributed network around that, you've got multiple points of entry, and they can compare traffic patterns between them, rather than it being a one source where it's a lot harder to discern where the traffic's coming from necessarily. So there's lots of different ways that they can help, because they have a different perspective of where the traffic's coming from and where it's going to.
And probably because they have all this data on traffic, not just to your own application, but to multiple IPs or domains, so they can, look at them holistically and see, okay, this is bad. Kind of also using like Stripe for payment processing. They see all this fraud detections and they can tell you, okay, we recommend this, and you can decide what you can turn on and turn off.
Yeah, totally. But yeah, that different perspective, because a DDoS might not just have one target. It might have multiple targets. And as you say, there's a holistic view there. If there are multiple targets being hit, individually, it might not seem yet like it's a DDoS. But as an aggregate across, let's say, 100 different endpoints that are being hit, it can look like that. Now, if you are controlling each one of those independently, you don't have visibility onto what the others are doing. But that holistic wrapper view of that proxy network layer around the world, it can detect from different points what's going on. And detect things that you might not be able to.
I think also most likely the infrastructure providers, they kind of, I think they also have like a way of protecting against some kind of attacks. Maybe not at the full scale of application security, but maybe on the network level, probably.
Yeah, it's usually on the network level. Are you thinking of PaaS services like Azure and Vercel and Heroku,
so
those
like
kind of things?
maybe not Vercel. I'm not sure to what extent Vercel does that, but like AWS, maybe Render, Fly.io.
Yeah,
I think.
Well, Vercel run their own CDN as well. Their documentation does recommend not to put a CDN in front of Vercel because they themselves are R1, and they do have a DDoS protection, I believe. I think they've got an IP level allow deny list mechanism. I can't remember for certain. But yeah, those type of platforms, I would say they are an interesting crossover between what Cloudflare was to start with, like that, just the CDN layer, and the hosting side of things. I think that has changed a lot in the past 10 years, especially 15 now. I'm getting old too quickly. With the advent of cloud hosting, cloud functions, everything being in the cloud, where you don't have to manage your own infrastructure. Pure CDNs were great when infrastructure was managed, whereas now that it's still managed, but it's managed by a platform
by the
provider.
same CDN providers.
Right.
Yeah, I had like I think Robin Max from Akamai. We were talking some weeks ago, probably last month, and we're also talking about the evolution of CDNs. It was mostly for the content delivery, and then we have edge, like running computes. I mean, small computes, sort of bringing the idea of lambdas now to the edge, but with a different kind of twist. And where it's headed in the future, where now only just run small applications like the workers. Now you can run an entire set of services like databases on the distributed networks of the CDNs.
It's crazy what you can do.
Yeah,
it's
so
amazing
now
how it all changes. There's lots of cycles when you look back at when I say historically, I mean even 10, 20 years of computing. Because I remember back in like late 90s, early 2000s. If you wanted to host a website, you would have to spin up either your own physical server somewhere in a data center, or like a lot of people would have one at home, and they'd use reverse IP, like dynamic DNS systems to host things at home. But
Yeah.
you'd need some kind of physical hardware, or you'd be able to get a virtual private server, which is kind of like a platform as a service containerization thing, but the early version of that. But you'd still have to start it up yourself. You'd probably have to install Apache or Nginx and
Yeah.
PHP and MySQL or Postgres or whatever you needed, and they would all be hosted on one server. And then if you wanted to scale, there were different questions of how you do that. And then things like Azure, Vercel, Heroku, these platforms as service providers started coming on the scene. And it was really interesting to me about 3 years ago to hear somebody who had gotten into the software engineering, especially the website of software engineering, in the like probably about 2012, 2014, and all they'd ever known was platform as a service.
Yeah.
And the deployment that we had was quite expensive. Like, it wasn't stupidly expensive, but it was cheap because we had 4 or 5 different sites that all interoperated with each other. And we determined it would actually be cheaper to move them all onto a virtual private server. So they spun up a Linode account, they created a VPS, they installed Nginx and got it all configured and ran it. And in the post project debrief report that came out, we're all in a Zoom session together, and he said, "You know what? Linode is so cool. You can run multiple websites on the same server." And
Yeah.
like, wow, that's an evolution to him. Like, no discredit to him at all. That's just the evolution of what he's seen. But I've seen like, but we were there before. Then we went to platform, and now some people are going back to, I'm just going to manage it myself. But if you
Yeah.
look what's happening at the edge is almost turning into the cloud of clouds. Because if you've got your application sitting on Vercel, and now you can have like multiple little parts of that running on the edge, whether it's on Vercel or through Cloudflare or somebody else. That's almost like the virtualization of the virtualization. We're getting very meta here. And at some point, somebody in the future is going to look at the cloud stuff that's sitting on the edge, and they'll find that it's, I don't know, more cost effective, or it's faster, or it's easier to maintain, or something. They'll bring it back to a platform as a service provider, and they'll say, wow, you can host multiple functions in one application.
Yeah. It's just like you said, going around in circles, and
Yeah.
maybe we would eventually not end up finding the one size fits all solution, because I think that's what all this market is trying to drive in at, like
But
one
there isn't
size
one.
fits all. Yeah,
I don't
but
think we've ever found anything in history, whether it's cars or I don't know, grocery stores. No, there's no one grocery store that'll meet every person's demands. To
yeah,
try and fit everything into one cookie cutter is just
yeah, but
ridiculous.
I think the perspective is more trying. I don't know, maybe from the business part, it's more like trying to seem like a monopoly in the market. So you drive all your opinion and tell people this is the only way. Like I think AWS did this a lot with Lambda and serverless. And so now when you say serverless, it's mostly attributed to Lambdas and all. And
Yep.
even for some managed services that is not fully managed, because they want to ride on the business wave, they also call themselves serverless. And it became a bit convoluted, and there were proprietary services from like AWS that you can use without knowing that this is possible outside of AWS, like step
Right.
functions and all. And then when you explain it to someone, it's like, oh, you're just doing like we've had like business process managers or workflows, so this is not new. But to them, it's new, or the newer generations now that started off using only Vercel,
Yeah.
without realizing that, oh, you can do a lot with your actual virtual machine. You can
Yeah.
install multiple applications, just put it behind a load balancer. So I think all this, everyone tries to sell you on the idea, which I think it works really well for a specific set of
Hmm.
application or users, but they usually fail at leaving out the part of which set of applications that it really works for. I
Yeah.
think recently I see Cloud Vercel talking about their CDN solution, and how CDN is like slow to invalidate cache or hard to configure. And I'm like, maybe in some specific scenarios, but not for, not for all scenarios. And this is like, like now Cloudflare has like, less than 150 milliseconds caching validation. And I mean, that's pretty fast. Some websites don't even return response in that time.
Right.
So, like we just keep going over and over these things, and nothing changes. Same with going from single page applications to server rendered, and now we're talking about static generation and whatnot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So everything comes full circle again. But I think that's a really good point about the lens that certain people have about certain technologies. Like the example of my friend who said, wow, I can run multiple websites, and your example of a lot of people look at serverless and they think AWS. And I think as developers, we do fall into the trap sometimes of, I've got two opinions about this, but we fall into the trap sometimes of, here are the technologies that I know and that I'm comfortable with. Therefore, when I have another problem, I will try and solve it with the technologies that I know that I'm comfortable with. I think there's a validity to that, especially when you're looking at like getting a proof of concept off the ground, or if you've got a startup idea and you just want a minimal viable product, you just get it out with the tools you know, because the sooner you get it out, the sooner you can validate whether or not there's a need for it. But there'll come a point at which you need to rewrite, and at that point you can make the architectural decisions about what should I actually be using. Because on the flip side of that, if all you've got is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail, right?
Yeah.
So if you're solving the problem of how do I get this screw into the wood, you're now using the wrong tool. So I think one of the things that I recommend to developers when they say what can I do to grow as a developer, to become like a mid-level or a senior level, is to broaden your horizon in terms of tech stacks that you know, not necessarily to a great depth. Like you don't need to become an expert in something you haven't used before. But there's this interesting graph I've seen of like how to focus on your expertise, and it's like a T shape. Like there's one thing you know really well, but you should have a thin knowledge of a whole lot of other things. And that really allows you to know whether or not the tool you know well is the right one for the job, whether you're the right person for the job, or whether there's something you need to learn more about. But I think we could all benefit from broadening our horizons in terms of tech stuff. And I've been doing the same myself recently. Like I came from a PHP background, as I mentioned. I've done a lot of JavaScript in the front end, and then obviously over the past 10 years, JavaScript is now ubiquitous. And I've got that focus on security, but I don't know very much about the .NET world. The last time I did any .NET was back in 2010, and I should probably learn a bit more about that. So there are lots of things that we don't know, we don't have the time to learn about. But if we just watch like a couple of YouTube videos just to get an idea of what is it and how does it work,
then
it gives us another tool in our tool belt.
Finding the time to explore like how do they do this in a different maybe language, maybe style of programming, and see how that helps you shape. Because when you just have one way of doing things, you think that's the best way you do things, and
Totally.
So for me, I started with .NET, and then I moved to JavaScript. And also, like moving to JavaScript was a bit tricky, because when I moved to JavaScript, I was trying to bring in some concepts like design patterns, dependency injection, and I realized, okay, most folks that do JavaScript don't even know those concepts, and they find it silly, So I had to adapt.
Although the good thing about JavaScript, I suppose it's the same as, so .NET is the framework, right? And you've got C# and various languages underneath it. JavaScript is also the language. If you go with something like Nest.js, the one with an S, Nest, not Next. Nest also has dependency injection and a couple of other things that are not typical for most JavaScript frameworks. So usually there's a framework out there that works for your brain.
Yeah, so I think that is why, like, I think for enterprise and people from .NET or Java background, they tend to lean more towards Nest and Angular because of those design patterns. Unlike the majority of having like Next.js with talking about like maybe I don't know the acronyms these days anymore. So so you realize that maybe some of what they are doing you could do it with a combination of maybe some of these backend frameworks and just Next.js or something similar. So
Yeah, totally.
now I'm also slowly learning a language called Glim, which
Oh
is
yeah.
which runs on. I mean, it can compile down to JavaScript, but also Erlang VM. And my interest there was mostly the Erlang VM because I saw. I think someone talked to me about Alexa, and then I
Hmm.
was interested. I found it interesting how the Beam, the Erlang VM works. How it deals with concurrency, and it was quite interesting to me how it's different from the event loop in the
Mm.
V8 runtime. When I still wrote C sharp, I wasn't concerned about the runtime, so I didn't care a lot about. I just know there was like okay multi-threading, and I was thinking of doing multi-threading a bit. But then I realized, oh, Vim is actually quite powerful and the things you can do with it. So now, learning the language and try to change my mental model of, how to program on this functional programming language. But the language is, I think it's fascinating because the person who design or develops the language borrows ideas from like Go, Rust, trying to bring the good parts of these multiple languages and see what is possible and how to make it better. And that is how I think we as developers should be, rather than being so how should I say it? Like just fighting for what language and like, oh, PHP is the best, or JavaScript is the best. Like we see, of course, we see new runtimes like Born, Dino in the JavaScript space, but and then we keep saying it is like 2 times fast, but running servers on Beam, you can see how faster they can perform because of its concurrency mode.
Yeah.
I feel we are also not even taking full power of the modern computers that we have, the multi-cores and all. Like they are not designed for some of these languages like JavaScript V8. We need newer kind of paradigm to fully utilize
Mm.
these systems easily and make our lives better than trying to squeeze in a lot of other stuff. But yeah.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, the way the computing is done now is very different to the way it was 10 years ago. I still remember when GPUs were all they were was things that sat in your computer to make your games look better.
Yeah.
CPUs is where all of the processing was at, and then suddenly that flipped.
Yeah, it's an interesting evolution.
Yeah.
Okay. Back to DDoS.
I have a tendency of going off on tangents. I don't know if you've noticed.
I think that's fine. I like it. It doesn't sound scripted, so we go a bit
It's true. It's true.
deeper. Hopefully the audience appreciates it as well, but for me, I like it that way. So for the DOS part, and I think also like the CDN gives you some kind of shit, but also they kind of need time to kind of detect this this kind of issues. So and then you need to, I think, on the application level, maybe from your infrastructure provider or from your own part, you need a way to sort of protect. Maybe that's also why some CDNs now have something they call origin shield, so that when there's multiple concurrent requests to the same origin, they kind of buffer it into one instead of keep hitting um, your servers.
Yeah.
And where does like your web application firewall comes into place in all these? And is this something you should leave it up to your CDN, or should you also have something with that you can manage, or you just manage it directly from your CDN?
I think in terms of so firewalling is a very generic term, and there's lots
Okay.
of different ways that can protect you. I mean, essentially, at the end of the day, a firewall is just a block that stops bad stuff coming through.
Yeah.
IP address filters to stop a DDoS would be a firewall of sorts. The advantage that some firewalls have is that they can actually do more introspection into the application, into the request that's coming through, and do more of a nuanced analysis of whether or not what's coming through looks like it's got any bad intentions or like it looks like an attack. And we touched on it a little bit earlier when we were just saying if a CDN is able to detect that there's like an SQL injection coming through, then it can try and break those or stop those requests from hitting your server.
But do
The
they?
down
I don't think they do that.
not a lot of them do, mostly because we've got HTTPS all the way through now. But if they are able to introspect, then they can look at the packet.
Yeah, they can,
Um,
but probably they do. They don't.
So the ones that do, and there are a couple that do, I think they might be moving away from that though, just because of the latency. But the way that it works at a network layer is the request comes into, let's say they use Nginx as a reverse proxy, for example. So it comes in and hits Nginx, and then it gets redirected to another service that does the introspection. And then a result comes back as to whether or not the request should go through, or a 403 is returned, or whatever should happen. The problem with that round trip is it can typically add 100 milliseconds or more to your request, which is not ideal. You were saying before that some caches can be invalidated within 150 milliseconds, and that's faster than most requests come through. Yes, if you're now adding 100 milliseconds onto a request, that's going to add impact to your customers, which you don't want. But on the other hand, it's the kind of thing that you might want to selectively turn on. If you have another system that's able to detect whether or not there's like increased traffic, for example, you might want to then turn on an extra mechanism saying, well, the traffic could be just because we became really popular, and that'd be great. On the other hand, it could be because we're under attack. Therefore, maybe we want to turn on this system that might slow people down a bit, but is going to keep our systems more secure. The downside to that is that while you can do things like checking the payload for potentially malicious looking patterns, you don't actually know anything about what's going on in the application. So is it actually a malicious pattern? Sometimes an SQL injection attack is very obvious from the context of the payload itself. Maybe you've got a query string on the end of the URL, and you've got lots of quotes and 1 = 1 and or admin = 1. And a lot of these patterns are very stereotypically SQL injection attacks to try and bypass a login mechanism, for example. But then there are other things that really only make sense when you have context of the application itself. So at that point, do you want to let the request get through all the way through to the application and then let your application decide whether or not the request should be honored or not, or whether the user should be rate limited? And there's a product that I worked with recently called ArcJet. They do that for, at the moment, it's JavaScript. For SDKs, we've got Next, Nest, Svelte, and Bun. We're working on another 4 in the next few months. But essentially, it's a middleware layer that will handle that for you. So it'll do rate limiting, it'll do bot detection, a few other things. But the advantage with that is you can actually tie it in. So generally, when you do rate limiting at a CDN level, you will have a fingerprint of who you're rate limiting. And generally, that's going to be an IP address.
Yeah.
The other kind of things you could do is on a cookie ID or any of the headers that come through, anything that you can see that's not encrypted in the request, so typically header information, can be used to fingerprint the particular request so that you can then say this future request came from the same person or from the same machine. At an application level, you can go even deeper and you can say, well, this request came from this logged in user, or this request came from somebody with this level of permission in the system. Maybe they were an admin or an editor. So you've got more contextual information about the person who's hitting your application. So you can be more selective about how you handle that request and whether or not you reject it. So there's 2 layers you can do that at. You can have the web application firewall, typical web WAF type thing at the network layer, or you can embed it in your application. And I think probably a mix of the two is the best. There are certain times when you absolutely know there's a DDoS attack. And what you want to do at that point is you want to stop at the network layer. You don't want your application to even be hit. For 2 reasons. One, it's going to impact your server's resources, which means that legitimate users are going to be affected. And 2, it's just a waste of time. So why bother?
And also, if you use like pay-per-use resources, so you also have to prefer to do it at the CDN level, so you don't have to pay for that.
Totally.
Which is why
even at the software level, while it doesn't eliminate the connection altogether, if you're detecting it at the start of the request and you return a 403 quickly or a 429 for rate limiting, you're at the very least you're reducing the amount of resources spent on that request.
Oh yeah, true. Yeah, I think recently, or maybe last year, I saw some people doing a lot of rate limiting with like Redis, within the application. And
Yeah.
for some people that I spoke to, why they do it is, like probably they didn't even know they could do it within the CDN. And for me, it was kind of a bit pointless if you pay for, like, maybe you're on Versa, you pay per request, let's say 5 million requests. So if you are doing that within your runtime in the middleware section of that, you're still paying for the processing. And why can't you do that within the CDN or within your provider's platform, so that you don't have to pay for the extra processing?
Yeah.
And also,
I think,
some people
again,
don't implement it properly with the
sure.
rate limiting.
So I think with rate limiting, it's an interesting one because there are multiple reasons why you might want to rate limit it. One of them could be because you don't want that $120,000 a month bill from a platform as a service provider because you suddenly got popular or you've been DDoSed.
Yeah.
And at that point, it makes sense to have at least some level of generic protection at the network layer. You might want to say, I want no more than this many hits per minute or this many per day in order to kind of limit your cost exposure. But on the other hand, there are other reasons for rate limiting. You might want every request to come through, so long as it's not going to cause you some kind of cost exposure. But once people are using your application, the cost of using that application, for example, if you've got if you're calling to a third-party LLM to enhance information about the way that a user is using your system, maybe you've got an AI-based chatbot, or maybe you're running a financial system and you're running a whole lot of transactions through an LLM in order to automatically categorize those transactions into groupings or something. If you're using something like that externally, or maybe it's even a tool for sending SMSs, but you're using a third-party provider for that, that's another cost. It's not just the cost of hosting, it's the cost of calling that provider. So you might still want every request to your application to come through, but then I want to maybe limit you from sending no more than 100 SMSs per hour. And that needs to be put into the business application, not into the network layer.
Yeah, so a combination of, like, those two level of protection really makes sense.
Yeah.
The one I struggled to really understand why I would do that was the bots protection, because then I would think, if I have a good CDN, I should have enough configuration to be able to do that at the network layer or at the CDN layer. But then for the other parts, like rate limiting, yeah, which totally makes sense. And
Yeah.
I mean,
But
you can,
even with bot protection, I might want to stop all of the bad bots, whatever you determine bad bots to be at the network layer. But I might still want curl to get through, because some people use that to hit my APIs. But on the other hand, within the application, I might only want to allow people to hit my application with curl if they're a registered user. So again, there are certain times when some of these security principles are not just about stopping access, but they're about controlling access based on other contextual information you have in the application.
Yeah. Yeah, that's quite, yeah. So a combination
In
of,
fact, thinking about the bot protection, a friend of mine who works at Permit, the access control company, he wrote a blog post recently about using bot detection to classify whether or not somebody was a human or a bot as an input mechanism into the permission system. So bots actually had a level of permission defined by the kind of bot they were. And I thought that was really clever. So it wasn't actually using it to block them at all. It was just deciding, do you have access to this resource? Well, you're a bot, so yes, or you're a human, so no. So it actually used it as an input mechanism into the decision platform.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That was really fun.
Especially if you trying to protect against AI bots like GPT-4 and all, scraping all your data.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think beyond just rate limiting and bot, I think you mentioned ArcJet, which they also give, like tools to like, I think, like, they have what they call Shield. So it does like SQL protection and a couple of other application security.
Yeah, it does. Covers like the top 10 common web attacks, that kind of thing. Yeah.
So it doesn't go beyond the OWASP top 10.
It does go beyond it, but that's kind of what, if you
Okay.
think of what the OWASP 10 talks about, that's kind of what it protects against.
Oh. Yeah, then that's interesting. I'm not sure if it's able to run in a serverless environment like Cloudflare workers, but I know, of course, maybe with typical Vessel functions. But then that brings the concept, of like, running your own application security at the edge, because now most of it would probably, at least most of it will run local to your application without having to make a network request. Although I think some kind of security checks, it does actually make a request to the object servers.
Yeah, so it's got a WASM component inside it. So every request goes via this WASM code base that sits in your application. So a lot of the decisions can come back really quickly, like less than a millisecond.
Okay.
And things like they've got email validation, and they've just released a sensitive information endpoint. So you can pass information in, it'll tell you whether or not it contains an IP address or an email address or whatever. The sensitive information one actually runs entirely in the SDK. So that never hits the API, because obviously there's no point. We don't want to receive potentially sensitive information, so we don't even send it. Same with some of the other mechanisms. The decision can come directly from the WASM component. Sometimes it needs to also make a request to the API to get a more definitive answer, but not all of the time. But even when it does have to hit the API, I was actually doing some performance tests on this a week or two ago, and on average, it adds 20 to 30 milliseconds to a request. So it's still pretty low.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I mean, I have not really done a lot with, for most applications being concerned about security, but giving a tool like that, I think it makes it easier, to use, and also to convince that, oh, let's build, start thinking ahead about security while you are developing. So like rate limiting, bot protection, adding the part of checking for sensitive information, and all those you can also, I think, maybe with Agjet and others, run the test locally to be able to check, oh, how can I simulate this kind of threats, and see how it performs and build the application, which makes it quite interesting.
That's the other thing that's quite useful with running some of the security stuff in your application, is that when you develop locally and you do all your testing, and then you push into production, and there's some kind of, I don't know, rate limiting or bot detection or some security mechanism in the network layer, suddenly your application's running in a different environment to the one it was tested in. Whereas when the security is wrapped into your application itself, like you say, you can test it locally and see what the impact of rate limiting is going to be. And then when you put it into production, it's going to behave the same. So it's much easier to detect issues with your security configuration earlier when it comes to a business application perspective of those security security measures.
Oh, nice. And beyond, so beyond like this OWASP, or how did they say it?
The OWASP.
OWASP, okay.
Yeah.
I just say OWASP.
OWASP. That makes sense too.
Yeah, so beyond the top 10, are there any other security related topic that you think one should be concerned about as an application developer?
So some things I've been looking at recently over the past few years is actually how we think about security. I still remember, so I started developing, I first started my development job. I started developing or hacking around with computers when I was 8, but my first job was back in 1999. And for those 10 years, the early 2000s or so, I remember that when you had, I don't think Jira even existed back then, but when you had your backlog of things to do, things in progress, things that are done, you would have all the features and all the bugs listed, and there would be like an estimate of how much time it's going to take. And then for each one of those, there would be another ticket saying, do the security stuff for that ticket. And that was with a view to making people aware of the fact that that needs to be done. And the problem with that is that you would get to a Friday, needed to deploy, we don't like deploying on Fridays, but it's a good example. So you get to Friday, you've got to deploy. All the features are in, but the testing hasn't been finished, and the product manager says, well, we're going to launch anyway, and we'll get the security stuff finished next week, and we'll just do another rollout. Of course, next week, that doesn't happen because there are other features and bugs to work on. Yeah. So security keeps getting forgotten, but we can see that it's there. Bruce Schneier back in 2000 wrote an essay. He's a software security type guy. He wrote an essay back in 2000, and he mentioned the concept of security as a process instead of security as a feature. So security as a feature, it's something you've got to drag across your to-do done kind of timeline. Security as a process, he said, if you actually make security a process of software engineering, then you can't leave it out, which in general was a great idea. And I first started seeing a change towards this in probably around about 2010, 2012. People started saying, okay, well, security is something we've got to actually build into our development process. The problem with that is that we still have those deadlines, and developers would still have to get code out by Friday for deployment. But now, instead of having 2 4-hour tickets, you'd have 1 8-hour ticket. But if you've still only got 4 hours to do it and it absolutely has to go out, you're going to do whatever you can as a software engineer to do it, which means you're going to design the solution, you're going to code the solution, then you're going to run out of time and not do the security.
Yeah.
Which now means that you as an individual coder, not the team who made the decision before, but you individually are making the choice to not include as many security checks in your software, or to be as rigorous around security as you could be because of that deadline. So now we don't even know that the security hasn't gone out. So that's not the developer's fault. That's the process's fault.
True.
So what I think we as software engineers, or anyone in the software development process from engineering through to DevOps and beyond, I think something we need to do more of is bring awareness of the implications of not doing security to the rest of the company. So if you're CFO, if you're HR manager, CTO and CEO should be a given already. But if the people in your organization who are not directly involved in the engineering side of things, if they understand the value of spending the time to make sure that you're making sure you're writing secure code, that you make sure you're writing maintainable code, because there's a lot of security issues in unmaintainable code. If you're making sure that your CI/CD pipelines are double checked, that you have all of the things in there that will help you be even more rigorous about your software, that you've got rollback mechanisms, that you've got processes for what happens if things go wrong. Like if there's a breach, what's the process for that? You don't like what I'm saying? Yeah, but if you can get buy-in from the company, then you've won the battle. Because suddenly, if you turn around to your product manager on the Friday and say, I'm not ready to deploy this because I haven't managed to make sure that everything's done to the process of what we're happy with security, they're going to be like, I totally understand. We'll have to either pull that feature out or we delay. But until the whole company buys into it, it becomes a battle of us against them. And that's not a healthy place to be.
Yeah, but then trying to get them to buy into that, it's, I think, very tricky.
Well, you can always blackmail them, or you can coerce them. So this is something I actually do in one of my talks, is I talk about how to coerce people with best intentions. So you talk to them about the Equifax leak about 10 years ago. There was $80 billion worth of transactions happened as the outcome of that Equifax leak, like because of the personally identifiable data. There was a hospital in, I think it was in Dortmund, it was somewhere in Germany, back about 10 years ago or so, that had I always forget the phrase for this, but when you get software on your computer that shuts it down, and they blackmail you into paying money to get your data back.
Software, you mean like a malware?
Yeah, but the one that comes up and says, send us 4 Bitcoin or we'll delete all your data. One of those. They had that, and it actually took down not just their administrative computing systems, but also their life support. Somebody actually died because of that. So there are really big implications. You can even talk about Stuxnet, which was the virus that attacked the Iranian nuclear power plants, nuclear reactors.
Someone says ransomware.
Ransomware, thank you. Yeah, Stuxnet attacked power plants that were siloed, like the computer systems were completely separate. They were not connected to the internet. And still somebody managed to devise some kind of software on a USB stick that when plugged into a laptop, would get the laptop to somehow instruct via an update patch to this software a virus into, like, it was insanely ingenious what they did, but really impactful. And then you just say, I really don't want us to be the next ones who have to get in touch with all of our customers and tell them that we've had a data breach. That's going to be bad for PR. That's going to be bad for future business. All we've got to do is spend a bit more time to make sure that we're crossing more T's and dotting more I's. We can never get 100%. But if at the moment we're at 80%, let's try and get to 90, maybe 95, in order to significantly reduce the chances of bad PR, business issues. Like, the hardest thing to do with when a product or a business you're working on or a product you're working on has a security vulnerability is managing the perception outcome of that in public. And if you're significantly popular enough, you could actually lose a whole lot of customers overnight, and you don't want that.
True.
So what's worse? Is it worse to spend a bit more time now to make sure that we're secure, or plan for what happens when we've got to announce that we've just had a massive data breach and now we're millions of dollars down because we've had to do payouts or we've been sued? Or, like, use a little bit of fear, but don't make shit up just to make people scared. But go back and have a look at what's gone wrong before. Can we learn from that? Because often we don't learn from the past. We are humans. We are doomed to repeat our failures. So let's not.
Yeah, I think that in most cases should work. And there's also the aspect of the engineer. How much do they know about security? Like, if they don't know about security, then they can't do anything. And if they also don't get proper training, they can't implement proper security.
It's true.
So
It's true. So what we need is for the developers who do know about security, they now have two jobs. One, try and get their companies to buy into the idea that software should be secure. And don't get me wrong, there are lots of companies out there who already like that. They're great.
yeah.
If you work for a company that's absolutely, no, we're just going to make as much money as possible and we don't care about the security of our data, maybe consider whether or not that's the right place for you to work. I'm not advocating anybody just stands up and quits. That's not what I'm saying. Just, evaluate where you are. But if you do know about security, I feel like it's almost your job to make sure that you find at least one other software engineer who doesn't know about security and help them understand.
Yeah, and that goes, just beyond security as well, like also with other aspects of your work. And but the challenge is always trying to coerce people to do the right thing and help them learn. But
yeah,
I believe, we still have a long way, but hopefully we get there.
Find a local meetup and offer to give a talk about something you learned in the past 6 months about security. A lot of people will probably think, yeah, but I haven't learned anything that interesting. I can guarantee that after, I don't know, 20 minutes, 10 minutes of conversation with any viewer, we could probably find something they've done in the past 6 months that would be interesting to other developers. Because internally, when you look at what you've learned, you think to yourself, well, some of that stuff that I learned, I didn't know, but it's kind of obvious and I should have known it. Or, like, we put ourselves down easily. The knowledge we have is actually really powerful, and sharing that knowledge is what's going to make us stronger.
Yeah, I saw a bit of a course from Pluralsight some years ago. I think it was from forgotten his name. The guy who makes Have I Been Pwned services.
Oh yeah, Troy
Hunt. Yeah.
Yep.
I think he made I think there were two courses which he tries to show you how you get hacked in your C# application, then shows you how to fix it. And when I saw a bit of it, I was quite interested in it because I didn't know those were possible, and I never thought of security in that way. I just know, okay, hash your password and the basic stuff. And now you mentioned it, I think maybe I should go check it out again and see how those attacks are being carried out, see how I can maybe secure it within maybe JavaScript or something, maybe also using ArcJet, for example. And it would be nice to also give talks and show people, because I think people get convinced when they can see how easy you can break their system, and then you show them, okay, this is maybe easy, maybe difficult to fix it. And Yeah, that could be a way to go.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So we are wrapping up gradually. Uh, one last question would be, or second to the last question would be, what would you recommend, or where would you recommend people go to learn more about application security?
So if you're not already familiar with the OWASP top 10, check that out, especially from a web application security perspective. They do have information that applies to non-web based software security as well. If you are in web application space, even if you don't do like the front end stuff, if you write APIs, they've actually got an API. I can't remember the name of it, but like the API security project or something like that, which specifically talks about obviously the API side of things as opposed to the the browser client side stuff more so. But OWASP is a great resource. If there's only one thing that you look at, it would be that. And NIST as well. I kind of never remember what it stands for, but they're like a uh, security advisory arm of, I believe, the US government. They are somewhat tangential to those.
NIST.
NIST. They've got it's a lot drier. They're more white papers, but they've got a lot of references for application security and information technology security stuff as well.
Okay.
But outside of that, I would say like YouTube is a really good resource nowadays. Pick something you want to learn about, stick it in the search bar, watch some
Yeah.
videos. It's not security related, but there's a Signal group chat that I'm on, and recently somebody was talking to me about End Service Bus, and I've heard of End Service Bus, but I've never really looked into what it is. So I spent like 20 minutes just watching 3 or 4 different videos, and I've got a good idea of what it is now, and I know whether or not I want to dig further. So even if you don't know whether you want to, if you don't know what you want to learn about security, because sometimes you don't know what you don't know, just do a general search for web application security tips or security in insert your language or framework of choice here.
Yeah.
So there's plenty of resources in terms of videos. Blogs are the same. I'm personally more of a video consumer. I like to see people's expressions. I like to hear people's voices while also looking at examples. But blogs, if you prefer reading, are a great resource for that as well. I just find it easier to find relevant videos.
Yeah. I think so if you do JavaScript, I think Liran Paul, I think he
Mm-hmm.
has some Node.js security books and maybe videos as well. So maybe I think he works with socket security or something similar. I'm not sure, but
He's at Sneak.
yes, Nick.
Hmm.
So check it out, and maybe I think you will find it useful as well.
Yeah.
And so where can people find you, and what kind of stuff can they reach out to you about?
I don't know if my handle is visible on the screen, but my first
Yeah.
name and my second name connected together, preceded by an @ is my Twitter handle. My DMs are open. That's the best way of getting in touch with me. I'm also the only Ben Dechrai on LinkedIn. So
Oh.
if you don't like the bird socials, you can use the blue square socials instead.
Yeah.
So that's how to get in touch with me. Kind of things you'll find me doing. I speak at conferences. I'm going to be in Porto at NDC Porto in a couple of weeks, talking about security. I generally talk about security privacy type stuff. Yeah, and if they want to get in touch, just hit me up via one of those two.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Thank you. We don't have any questions from the listeners, just some comments. I think Alex said, well said, Ben. I think when you describe something about DDoS in the
Oh yeah,
beginning. So um thank you, listeners. Hope
yeah.
you
Thanks for
join
coming on.
again next week, because next week we have Tim from Akamai talking about some fast loading tips and also 103 early hint. So if that's your thing, join again next week and let's learn a bit more. And thank you so much, Ben, for doing this with me. I
Thanks
had
for having me,
fun.
Peter. It's been fun.
Yeah, it's been fun. And subscribe on the YouTube, if I don't know where the button is, but whichever way, just subscribe so we can hang out again next week, and let me know what topics you would like to listen to. And see you next week. Bye bye. much.